Like nothing else, they represent the Middle Ages. Castles take us back to dramatic times. They're shrouded in myths and legends.
Castles are places where people lived and worked and died.
They were economic centres, fortified homes, and sites of countless battles. They become part of the European heritage.
History was made in any castle.
Yet what if the enemy was at the gates? Europe in the early Middle Ages. It was the beginning of a new era, a time when castles became status symbols. Bastions of power for rich nobles, like Count Otto of Hammerstein. Castles were the pride and joy of the elite, a fitting place of abode. A preacher, Berthold of Regensburg, wrote about them, "We have to kneel in front of you, to rise in front of you, and one has to fear you. You have a lot of space around you, you ride and you walk in splendor, and you have towering castles and fair ladies." The nobility was highly class conscious, and this was reflected in their homes, their clothing, and their food. But on this morning, Otto of Hammerstein and his wife had to settle for simple mush and some bread, and there was only water instead of wine. The reason for this meager meal: outside the walls of Otto's proud castle, troops, led by the emperor himself, had begun to lay siege to the fortress. Emperor Henry II was hell-bent on taking Castle Hammerstein at all costs. Yet, due to its position, Hammerstein was near invulnerable, and Henry lacked the means to storm it with a direct charge. Today, high above the Rhine, there are only ruins left of Castle Hammerstein, which is said to have been one of the first in the Middle Rhine Valley. Plants have long reconquered the walls, which were erected at the turn of the first millennium. Allegedly, Otto himself built the castle and duly named it Hammerstein. The possessions of his family spread out east of the Middle Rhine. Legacies and the dowry of his wife had increased his position in the country. A growing threat to the emperor, whose power was constantly challenged by self-confident lords throughout his realm. Otto, for instance, had a number of castles laid out over his fiefdom, like a net with which to strengthen his power. Or at least, so it seemed, since castles as such were merely static strongholds. A safe base for soldiers placed at strategic points like valleys, rivers and lakes to pacify and administer the country. During the 11th century, their garrisons were mostly wooden motte and bailey castles, which were cost-effective and quickly built. Secured by ramparts and fosses as barriers to keep off unwelcome intruders. Quite like today, whether in the form of a garden fence or a factory wall. If you wanted to play it safe, you built in stone. Provided your purse and the resources of the surrounding area allowed it. For any attacker, a castle of solid stone with a tower and high walls was definitely a challenge. If built in a prominent position, like Castle Hammerstein, it was practically impregnable. There were three ways to seize a castle: from beneath, by direct assault, or by siege. Hammerstein's underground of solid rock, however, made tunneling impossible. On the steep slopes, neither siege towers nor catapults could be put in place. Thus, the only option was to go for the castle gate. Yet there was only one way to get there, if you wanted to bring up a battering ram: the narrow access path beneath the wall. And from up there, the defenders could keep the attackers under continuous fire. Cutting off the castle supply was less of an effort and posed the biggest threat to the besieged. The effective elements of a castle's defense are still being used by architects today. In 2017, the BND, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, moved into their new headquarters in the center of Berlin. It's a maximum security building designed by Jan Kleihus.
In a way, the center of the BND is comparable to a castle. Here we have a fence whose function is obvious and meant to be so. There is a ditch, and in certain parts the walls are extremely thick, just like in a castle. And finally, there is a windowless base. So, in principle, that is, metaphorically as well as architecturally, we have all the elements of a castle or fortress.
Then, as today, the entrance poses a particular challenge to architects. It must provide security, but also reflect the importance of the residence.
That too is an element we find in the architecture of medieval castles. The two gatehouses are meant to impress, like a portal bearing the owner's coat of arms. On the one hand, they serve as an entry for the employees, yet at the same time, they function as a prestigious ramp.
In the Middle Ages, the lords of a castle too considered the gate as a kind of showpiece. If, on the other hand, representation wasn't that paramount, the gate, as the obvious weak point in the castle's defences, would be given special protection. You'd have crenels and loopholes, through which attackers could be fought with arrows and stones. Next, a portcullis would back up a solid wooden gate. Since the end of the High Middle Ages, drawbridges were set up to deny access to the gates, and there was no drawbridge without a ditch. A ditch or fosse was the simplest means to keep the castle's attackers at bay. Whether it was dug out or carved into the rock, siege engines could then only be brought close to the walls after the ditch had been painstakingly refilled. A water-filled ditch or moat also contributed towards sustaining the castle's inhabitants. In it, fish like carp or crustaceans like crab were kept, which would be served at the table of the lord of the castle. In 1402, in his book Bella Fortis, military technician Conrad Kaiser noted that ditches were even used to keep livestock. Especially popular were geese and chickens, but also dogs as a kind of living alarm system. During a siege, however, they quickly lost their usefulness. For 3 months, Otto had managed to withstand the siege. But winter in a castle was harsh. Even the furniture had already been burned. There was no option left but to surrender. According to custom, Otto and Ermengarde now had to humiliate themselves in front of the victorious emperor, dressed as penitents. Barefoot and in simple garments, they walked up to Henry. First, they had to plead guilty to having brought about the conflict. Then, they had to implore forgiveness. Henry II didn't grant mercy as easily as his predecessors. To him, clemency was only one option. In the case of unyielding resistance, he did not hesitate to impose the death penalty on an aristocratic opponent. However, Otto and Ermengarde were spared the scaffold, but they did not escape unscathed. Otto's possessions were confiscated. Hammerstein became the emperor's property, and thus a Reichsburg, an imperial castle.
At the top of the medieval hierarchy, there was the ruler, who had to administer and pacify a huge realm. And to accomplish this, he would build castles at certain points, which he then garrisoned with nobles or knights who owed him allegiance.
Building their own castles, the traveling emperors early on created a net of seats within the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial castles served as strongholds, as well as royal residences, and they were ideally suited to remind the local rulers of the presence of the monarch, a concept unique to Europe. In early medieval France, there was no administrative structure like that of the traveling emperors. Therefore, the architects of its castles aimed less at representation and more at well-fortified designs. Up to the end of the Middle Ages, French donjons fulfilled a double function. They were both residential and defensive buildings. To defend the castle, its garrison would fire arbalests and bows through the crenels. Protruding openings up on the tower, so-called machicolations, provided the possibility of fighting attackers even at the foot of the building. It was a successful design, imported to Britain by William the Conqueror in the wake of his invasion in 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry is a contemporary record of a successful campaign, up to the Battle of Hastings. It also shows the pillars of his policy of conquest, the castles by which he secured the country. In the end, he had seized or newly built nearly 100 of them. Thus, the features of the castles of northern France became the core of British castle architecture. But across the Channel, with time, a rectangular floor plan prevailed, the so-called Great Tower or Keep. One of them is still a landmark of London. The White Tower, commissioned by William the Conqueror.
The reason for building a building like the White Tower is you can combine three things in one building. One is a residence. It is undoubtedly defensive. I mean, you could defend the White Tower against an army for a long time. And thirdly, and most importantly, it looks great. A tower is always something that dominates the landscape. It always catches the eye. It always sends a message to you about the power of the person who owns it. Copying the White Tower was a kind of industry in the 12th century, and the details of its construction were referred to by all the designers of great towers thereafter.
However, on the continent, elaborate construction programs like those of the Norman conquerors were rare. A chronicler, Bruno of Merseburg, mentioned that Emperor Henry IV had 8 castles built near Goslar to protect the silver mines in the Harz Mountains. Yet, as the chronicler notes, the garrisons at once set about subduing, oppressing, and exploiting the nearby lands. So it wasn't just emperors and kings who benefited from the new seats of power. The administrators, appointed by the rulers, became ever more important as their property and influence steadily increased. In the High Middle Ages, the so-called ministerials formed a band of nobles in their own right. Famous dynasties like the von Pappenheims sprang from ordinary administrators of a castle. Almost 100 years have passed since Otto had defied the emperor. Now Castle Hammerstein too had become the seat of a ministerial by the name of Ludwig, who was to bear witness to the decline of this once proud fortress. Castles weren't merely strongholds for soldiers and their rulers. They were also gigantic vaults for the treasures of the sovereigns. Since 1105, Hammerstein was keeper of the most precious treasure in the whole of the Holy Roman Empire, the imperial regalia. Possession of these insignia was paramount for any king intending to make a bid for imperial rule. Replicas of the scepter, the sword, the imperial crown, and the holy lance bear witness to the former treasury's splendor. If an emperor was crowned without the imperial regalia, the legitimacy of his rule would be doubted from the very beginning. Thus, to protect them from unauthorized access, They were kept in the empire's safest castles. But by then, Hammerstein was no longer a prime choice. As new castles challenged its position, Ludwig helplessly had to look on as Hammerstein's greatest treasure was removed at the behest of the emperor. From now on, the castle was merely a backwater of imperial politics. For more than 2 centuries, there was a saying, "He who has trifles has the empire." In 1125, the imperial regalia found a new treasury in the Palatinate, and Castle Trifles became the most important site in the Holy Roman Empire. Trifles, however, wasn't just a safe depository for gold, silver and precious stones. In spring 1193, the most valuable prisoner of his time was brought here. The King of England, Richard the Lionheart. He had become a hostage of Emperor Henry VI. Richard had made a lot of enemies in Europe during the Third Crusade. Now he had to make his journey home overland, disguised as a pilgrim. But near Vienna, in December 1192, his cover was blown. Richard wasn't called the Lionheart for nothing. He was as proud as he was short-tempered. Yet fate would turn him into a pawn in one of the largest extortion schemes ever. The King of England was arrested. A prisoner of his class would of course be treated accordingly. After all, the emperor expected a king's ransom for him, as was common when holding an aristocratic hostage. So Richard wasn't thrown into a sinister dungeon, but, as it was said, kept in honorable confinement. Anyway, today's researchers are positive that only a few castles actually had gloomy jails. So not every sinister-looking room in a castle was used as a dungeon. Floor plans often led to the assumption that the dark, uncomfortable, and obviously unusable basements of a tower were used as dungeons.
Of course, there are parts in every castle where, with a bit of imagination, that might have been possible. The usual basement of a keep was between 6 and 8 meters deep and was only accessible from above. So, in theory, such a room might have been used as a dungeon. But how did you get in there? There was just a hole from above. So I don't think that this would be used as a dungeon. There were exceptions, of course, but that wouldn't have been the rule.
For the emperor's aristocratic prisoners, the conditions of their confinement could differ significantly, though. In 1113, Margrave Wipprecht of Groich, for instance, was kept here in chivalrous imprisonment, much like the King of England. His co-prisoner, Archbishop Adalbert of Mainz, however, didn't fare as well. On his release, he was said to have been close to death, reduced to a skeleton, and with a long grey beard. In 1194, a group of Sicilian noblemen who had been involved in a conspiracy against the emperor and were imprisoned in Trifles suffered even more badly. After another assassination attempt 3 years later, Henry VI had the prisoners blinded as a measure of reprisal. Richard, however, would be spared such cruelties. During his imprisonment, he even enjoyed all kinds of benefits. Allegedly, he even held drinking feasts and wrestling matches with his guards. And although in custody, he was allowed to conduct his state affairs from Castle Trifels. Legend has it that he was found and liberated by a wandering English troubadour. Yet the truth is more prosaic. The emperor's demands for Richard's release were huge. He wanted military support for the conquest of Sicily, And above all, ransom money Richard would be hard-pressed to raise. But was there any other choice? Finally, he accepted the terms. 35,000 kilograms of silver, about triple the annual income of the English crown. A king's ransom so large, it caused a severe economic crisis in England. But in 1194, Richard regained his freedom. During his crusade to the Holy Land, and while imprisoned within the Holy Roman Empire, Richard had gleaned considerable knowledge of castles and their designs. And 2 years after his release, he put that knowledge to good use. He gave orders to build the imposing Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, intending to lead the continental art of fortification into a new era. After just 1 year of construction time, Richard could look with pride on his brainchild, and is alleged to have said, "Behold, how fair is this year-old daughter of mine."
On a beaucoup dit que Chateau Gaillard
Chateau Gaillard was long considered to be the first castle incorporating the revolutionary step from 12th century passive fortification to active defense. Today we view this a little differently, because Chateau Gaillard has neither predecessors nor successors.
It's very difficult to identify any particular piece of the apparatus of military architecture which you can say, right, that occurs first in the Levant and then second in Europe, and it must have been copied. The Crusaders of various periods came back with an impression of not Islamic fortifications, but Byzantine fortifications.
But just 8 years later, Richard's attempt to establish a new architectural design for an impregnable castle failed. In 1204, the French king Philip II attacked Chateau Gaillard with 6,000 men. They overcame the first wall using a siege tower. Then, crawling through a lowly positioned latrine, they reached the second courtyard. From there, they dug a tunnel and poured into the central court, where the final battle took place. During the previous centuries, there had been major advances in the techniques of siege warfare, and their impact on Chateau Gaillard was immediate. If a castle was skillfully placed, however, it was rarely possible to use siege engines, and any direct charge would result in heavy losses. Miners were much more effective. They were able to dig protective ditches right up to the castle. Once there, the sappers with their pickaxes, hammers and chisels could peck holes into the base of the wall and provide the attackers with a means of access. A tunnel filled with combustible material below the wall was even more effective. Fire would consume the wooden beams, causing the wall to collapse. More daring, a charge using scaling ladders or even human pyramids. There are reports of such attacks up to the late Middle Ages. An even more cunning tactic, which was often used, was to bribe an inhabitant or smuggle in a traitor. In the year 1331, at Castle Eltz on the Moselle River, another significant factor became apparent when it came to castle battles: psychology. Bishop Balduin of Trier wanted to seize the castle to put the knights of Ehrenberg, Schöneck, Waldeck and von Eltz in their place. The Eltzer feud, as it was called, had been smouldering for months. The bishop had sent a small army to lay siege to the castle, with a view to cutting off supplies and thus force its garrison to give up. Yet the longer the siege lasted, the more difficult it became to keep up morale among Balduin's troops, because somehow or other the castle's inhabitants managed to hold on. Time and again, the Eltzers succeeded in smuggling provisions into the castle. The siege had turned into an endless game of cat and mouse, and with persistent failure, the ranks of the besieging army began to thin out alarmingly. There was only one way to avoid this: improve your own troops' living conditions in the field. For instance, by taking them out of the cold, damp tents into solid accommodation. And so, not far from Eltz, the besiegers built a castle of their own. Today there are only a few ruins left of this counter-castle, or Trutzburg, just a few hundred meters away from Castle Eltz itself. On this square-shaped ground, there once stood a tower house shielded by a wall against Castle Eltz. Its position is crucial. Despite the proximity to their fortress, the Eltzers were unable to prevent its construction. A building like this must have put huge psychological pressure on the besieged. The counter-castle was used again and again as a stratagem. In the Hessian town of Runkel, its eponymous castle still dominates the site. Opposite Runkel, Castle Schadeck was finished in 1288. Castles like this were an excellent method of demonstrating to your opponents, we are here to stay. There were many factors that determined the duration of a siege. The attacker's tenacity and the perseverance of the besieged were among the most significant. Castle Rheinfels above Saint-Gouard and Chateau Montségur in the Pyrenees each put up resistance for nearly 1 year. Castle Turant on the Moselle River, as well as Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, even withstood for 2 years. They were the prime examples of what could be achieved in the defense of a well-fortified site, like that of Castle Eltz too. Yet only if a castle was well prepared would it hold out that long. But this called for the defenders to stockpile sufficient supplies of food, which could be stored for a long time.
The best way to capture a castle is to starve it out, because no castle is impregnable. You often hear the impregnable castle of this, that, and the other. There's no such thing. You can have a castle which is pretty much impregnable against physical attack, but no castle can hold out forever because the people within it have to eat and they have to drink. And if those things run out, you're finished.
So even a lot of provisions weren't much use if the water supply were to dry up, and a single person is estimated to consume about 5 liters per day. A spring inside the castle grounds was rare, and any water supply lines from the outside could easily be cut. Castles on hills were particularly dependent on collecting rainwater or digging a well.
The basic means of water supply in a hill castle was the cistern. In the lowlands of northern Germany, that would of course have been different. So, if you find deep wells, they're usually features of imperial castles, like Triffels, Kyffhäuser and Gralstein at the turn of the 12th to the 13th century, which are the most prominent examples. Yet, even there, you would look for a site a bit further away to avoid having to dig really deep.
At Castle Triffels, the well shaft had to be driven nearly 80 meters into hard rock. It was back-breaking work for the miners. In extreme cases, shafts would reach as deep as 176 meters. Then the construction of a well could last up to 40 years and cost as much as the overall site. At Castle Eltz, they had to make do with a specially built cistern which caught the rainwater. Yet its inhabitants managed to survive the siege reasonably well. The counter-castle close by did little to impress the besieged. So, the attackers brought in the heavy artillery. A gigantic catapult was put into place. And then But the machine wasn't intended to destroy the castle. It was only meant to spread terror among the inhabitants, who now could no longer step outside their doors without risking their lives. In 1333, Castle Eltz was bombarded with a trebuchet like this. Contemporaries called it an instrumentum diabolicum, a device of the devil. In the Bavarian town of Wunsiedel, they've built a replica. And since it's fully workable, we can put the medieval super slingshot to the test on a firing range of 130 meters. The 16-meter high contraption is operated by Michael Fuchs and the members of Wunsiedel's Historical Society. Its construction relies on medieval representations, and it's been adapted to modern standards only insofar as safety requirements are concerned. Experimental archaeology like this is an established means towards checking the authenticity of ancient texts. According to medieval sources, trebuchets were used to shoot at targets over a distance of between 300 and 500 meters. Tests have shown that at full capacity, trebuchets are able to hurl stone balls of 75 kilograms over a distance of 1 kilometer onto a target of just 5 square meters. The impact of the projectiles reveals the efficiency of the catapult.
Of course, it's fascinating to see the impact of such a device. It's easy to imagine what would have happened to a castle under such fire. The projectiles wouldn't have smashed the walls, but you could have demolished the battlements and aimed at the weak points of a castle, which was actually a sitting duck.
Yet stones weren't the only items in the gunner's arsenal. There were other, more devastating devices. One of those who published his observations on the application of the devilish devices was an Italian engineer from Siena named Taccola. He has passed down numerous drawings of real as well as of imaginary war machines. He even recommended the use of firebombs or blazing live animals, which would run around the castle setting everything on fire. If this weren't enough, feces, carrion and dead bodies were used as biological weapons, intended to spread plagues and to lower the morale of the besieged. In the highly religious Middle Ages, the besieged often prayed for divine intervention. Those who lacked confidence in the ways of the Lord opted for an earthier exit strategy.
The existence of escape tunnels is yet another myth. It's said that there were subterranean corridors from one castle to another of up to 1 kilometer in length, or that some even passed under rivers. However, to dig tunnels like that calls for highly advanced mining techniques. The closest we get to that are the so-called earth stables, which can be found especially in Bavaria. It's true they were dug in the Middle Ages and often served as shelters, but we know of only very few proper escape tunnels.
Understandably so, since they harbored a definite risk and had to be constantly guarded. If a tunnel could lead you out of the castle, it might just as quickly lead you in. The owners of Castle Eltz rejected this emergency design. In 1333, after a massive bombardment by the trebuchet, the Knights of Eltz surrendered. They had to accept Balduin as their feudal lord, who rubbed even more salt into their wounds, letting them keep their castle, but bestowing on them the counter-castle as a fiefdom, which they had to maintain at their own expense. But 150 years later, a new era had begun. In the late Middle Ages, gunpowder weapons provided hitherto unknown opportunities to fight back. Quite like the salesman of today going from door to door, Back then, cannon dealers were traveling from town to town and from castle to castle. Like all salesmen through the ages, they were quite often looked upon as a nuisance. On the other hand, the interest in military gadgets or superweapons was as widespread among medieval knights as it is among the power-hungry dictators of our time. Of course, they didn't travel with real guns, but with scaled-down models, included in the price when buying the original. Some of these miniature cannons can still be found at Castle Eltz. Its owners developed a veritable passion for collecting these models, since they were also used as children's toys.
A cannonball from these models, we've tried it, will smash through some 15 centimeters of solid oak or rip off 3 heads in a row. That's just an estimate, of course, so you had to make sure that your kids didn't fool around with them.
Yet there was still a long way to go until guns of that force became common. The first cannons impressed more because of their black powder explosions than their actual penetrative power. In Central Europe, it was the future Emperor Maximilian I who at the end of the 15th century ordered the production process of cannons to be perfected. His Book of Armaments features illustrations of his numerous guns, from the small field gun to the powerful bombard able to crack a castle. Emperor Maximilian went down in history not only as the first knight, but also as the first gunner of the empire. New weapons called for new means of protection. Up till then, fortifications had been designed merely to withstand an attack by foot soldiers, battering rams, and missiles, or to demonstrate the owner's social status. The keep, for instance, which from the 12th century onward became a characteristic element of castles in Central Europe, didn't serve any military purpose, but rather as a widely visible symbol of power. During the 13th century, the shield wall was another element intended to impress. Yet, as it was particularly high and massive, it doubled as a protective wall to shield the rest of the castle against bombardment by heavy catapults. At the same time, gatehouses, auxiliary towers protruding from the curtain, portcullises and drawbridges were introduced. From the 14th century onwards, the outer ward became popular as an additional rampart to fight charging foot soldiers. The advent of firearms, however, forced the architects to explore new methods when it came to building castles. Yet, not everybody was prepared to upgrade the defense of his castle and to invest in new technology. In the late Middle Ages, numerous nobles simply sold their ownership rights of their castles. Some, however, believed that the medieval fortress still had a future. Like Franz von Sickingen, who in 1518 made a bid for Castle Narnstein in the Palatinate. He was thoroughly acquainted with the latest military developments and their efficiency. True to his motto, to dare and to act, he intended to prepare Castle Narnstein for a new era. Von Sickingen, the archetype of a robber knight, deemed the castle's position as perfect for a retreat from his raids. High above Landstuhl, Narnstein rises on a huge red rock which gave it its name. For more than 3 centuries, it had dominated the area, but it was not prepared for artillery fire. All over Europe, architects developed new components to protect castles against ever more powerful weapons. In Lower Austria, at Castle Achstein, the owners used an array of massive blocking walls to make any attacker's access to the inner castle more difficult. Like at Castle Wildenstein, a kind of oversized shield wall, a so-called bastion, was set up to protect the main castle. From up here, even the outer area of the castle could be defended with gunfire across the outer bailey. Between 1470 and 1540, however, all across Europe, a new form of castle architecture was established. At Fortress Coburg in Franconia, these alterations can still be retraced. To protect the walls against cannon fire, they had to be strengthened. The solution was a widening of the ramparts by further brickwork and heaped up earth behind the walls. The newly built platform, in turn, provided sufficient space for artillery. In 1527, even the famous Albrecht Dürer devoted himself to the new defensive architecture and published a paper titled "Some Instructions on the Fortification of Towns, Castles and Hamlets." He specifically mentioned turrets as a new means of fortification. They would provide excellent protection against iron cannonballs, which, in contrast to the outdated stone projectiles, in Dürer's words, would knock harder. Castle Munau across the Swiss border near Schaffhausen was set up as late as 1589 and relied entirely on turrets, as recommended in Dürer's work. Just a few kilometers further east, Castle Hohentville was made into a fortress in 1521. In all, the owner spent more than 50,000 guilders on its construction, the equivalent of 15 million euros. Yet the investment paid off. Hohentville withstood 5 sieges. In 1496, King Ferdinand of Aragon had a unique fortress built at Saus-le-Château in southern France. It combined the tried and tested fortress architecture of the Middle Ages with new elements of fortification.
Gunpowder and castles is an interesting love-hate relationship. It's a very long time before castles start changing in their form in order to resist artillery. In fact, it's kind of it's the other way around. The first sign of artillery architecturally is to use artillery in castles.
As can be seen at Castle Narnstein. Between 1519 and 1523, Franz von Sickingen had turned it into an artillery castle. Its centerpiece was now the huge battery tower in the east. It shielded most parts of the castle from attack and simultaneously served as an emplacement for numerous cannons. Since Sickingen was well aware of the destructive potential of large caliber guns, he never set out on a campaign without his giant cannon, the Nightingale. He even had a verse emblazoned on it. "Nightingale I'm called, sweet and lovely is my song. To whom I sing, the days are long." A cynical warning to the besieged. However, the mere presence of such a monstrous weapon could open the gates of castles and of towns. Handling a mega gun like the Nightingale could pose problems, though, especially in bad weather. Due to its sheer weight, the monster often got stuck underway and had to be pushed inch by inch. Yet for von Sickingen, the efforts paid off, earning his upkeep by waging war on other nobles and their castles, as well as on entire towns, and becoming one of the most dreaded robber knights of his time. He insisted on the time-honored right of a knight to wage feuds, in other words, to settle disputes by force of arms. Like today's collection agencies, feud entrepreneurs like Sickingen would also enforce recourse claims, be they justified or not. It was the last attempt by the knights to save their kind from oblivion. For centuries, they had been the elite forces on the battlefields of Europe, earning glory and considerable wealth. Now, foot soldiers and firearms had supplanted them, ending their main source of income. Their castles, too, dwindled in importance. The hubs of the New World were the cities, where power and influence, trade and innovation came together. The old symbols of power were nothing more than reminders of a proud past. In the ancient center of Nuremberg, you can still find the Nassauer House. It was erected by citizens who wanted to impress their neighbors with elements of a stately castle. In Regensburg, 100 kilometers further southeast, from the 13th century onwards, patrician families built keep-like towers. They are a common sight south of the Alps, but rare in the north. Like the keeps, they represented the power and wealth of the families living there. However, cities could only maintain their wealth and influence if properly protected. City walls, like here in Lübeck, functioned like the curtain walls of a castle, albeit on a somewhat larger scale. If a city was rich, it was of course a lot easier to upgrade its defences, as is shown by the city model of Ingolstadt, made by Jakob Sandner. In the 16th century, no fewer than 8 bastions were added to the medieval city wall. For Franz von Sickingen, his latest campaign against a well-fortified city ended in disaster. In 1522, Trier withstood his guns for 5 days without having to mourn a single dead. Von Sickingen had to withdraw and was hunted by a coalition of princes who pursued him as far as Castle Narnstein. They assembled the largest military force the region had ever seen. The castle did not withstand the barrage from their numerous guns for long. After 2 days, it was ripe for attack. Franz von Sickingen had been heavily wounded by falling debris from the castle walls. A few days later, he died of his injuries. Narnstein fell into ruins and never again served as a defensive stronghold. To historians, events like this heralded the end of the great days of the castles. Most of them couldn't keep up with the ever-advancing technology. Yet firearms were only the tool, not the trigger of their demise.
But castles themselves, while they were castles in the full sense of an aristocratic residence, a fortress and a symbol of authority and so on, don't really come to an end, as it were, because of artillery. It's the institutional changes, the political and social changes in the country that bring about the demise of the castle in its medieval form. It isn't really artillery. That's a separate issue.
Just 1 year after the fall of Castle Narnstein, the writing was on the wall. The era of the castle had come to an end. In the southwest of the empire, the peasants revolted. It was a desperate attempt by the lowest social classes to free themselves from oppression by their secular and clerical overlords. One of their targets were the castles. In many places, their inhabitants simply fled. So only a few had to be besieged, yet soon they would also fall. Between 1524 and 1526, about 1,000 of them were torn down by the peasants. In the following decades and centuries, castles became less and less important. At the beginning of the 14th century, more than 100,000 of them had spread throughout Europe. But from then on, their numbers steadily declined. Today, nearly 40% of them are in ruins, and only 10% have survived. Yet, even if the age of the castles had come to an end, there was still a desire for a safe place. It was about this time that in a feud-stricken Italy, architects came up with a design that would shape Europe for the next 400 years.
It was a time of transition for defensive military architecture. Engineers had to find solutions to provide the perfect means of protection regarding the new situation. This meant that fortifications were needed that could stand up to the new armory, since Italy during the 16th century was in a constant state of war.
The bulwarks became huge bastions, projecting from the curtain walls like arrowheads. From them, every nook and cranny in front of the fortress wall could now be covered by firearms. At first, these innovations only served to protect residential castles. But these places would soon lose their residential character. In Jülich, for example, the design of an Italian architect turned a so-called bastioned palace into a citadel used for purely military purposes. Fortresses like these are military successors of the medieval castles. Up to the 20th century, they would continue to shape the armed conflicts of Europe. And the castles? For centuries, they merely served as landmarks or quarries. Then, at the end of the 18th century, perspectives changed. The emerging age of Romanticism rediscovered the ruins. Legends were woven around them. Poets extolled their decayed splendor. Even new castles were built, reflecting a glorified view of the past. Castles became sites of historical remembrance. No other type of building symbolizes an entire era in the way the castle represents the European Middle Ages. And to this very day, many of them doze like a sleeping beauty, deep within the forests, covered by greenery. For others, which down the centuries were altered by repeated rebuilding, there are plans to restore them to their original condition. But doesn't this mean negating the eventful history of these impressive buildings? Hasn't every era the right to leave its traces on these bastions of power?